You think silence is empty. You believe it's the absence of something, the absence of sound, the absence of movement, the absence of life itself. But I'm going to tell you something that might disturb your comfortable assumptions. Silence is not empty at all. Silence is the most full thing there is. It is the foundation upon which every sound rests, the canvas upon which every word is painted, the space in which all meaning lives and breathes. Without silence, there would be no music. Without silence, there would be no speech. Without silence, you would not exist as you do now, capable of hearing, of thinking, of being aware. Silence is not the opposite of sound. It is the mother of sound. It is not the negation of existence. It is existence itself, pregnant with infinite possibility. Now, the peculiar thing about silence is that we are absolutely terrified of it. We fill our lives with noise, constant chatter, endless music, the drone of television, the buzz of notifications, the racing commentary of our own thoughts. We do everything in our power to avoid encountering silence because silence confronts us with something we've been running from our entire lives, ourselves, the unadorned, undecorated, naked truth of what we are. And what are we? That's precisely what silence reveals, if we have the courage to listen. When I speak of silence, I'm not merely talking about the absence of audible sound, though that's certainly part of it. I'm speaking of a deeper silence, the silence that exists beneath your thoughts, beneath your feelings, beneath all the turbulent activities of your consciousness. This is the silence that the mystics have always spoken about, the silence that the Buddhists call shunyata, emptiness, though that word is terribly misunderstood in the West. We hear emptiness and think of a void, a nothingness, something depressing and nihilistic, but that's not what it means at all. Emptiness in this sense means empty of separate, independent existence, empty of the illusion that things exist in isolation from one another. It means transparent, open, free. The paradox I want to explore with you is this: in true silence, everything speaks. When you stop the constant internal dialogue, when you cease imposing your interpretations and judgments upon reality, when you simply become quiet and attentive, that's when you begin to hear what the universe has been saying all along. The trees speak, the wind speaks, the rhythm of your own heartbeat speaks volumes. Even the spaces between things, the gaps, the pauses, the intervals, these speak perhaps most eloquently of all. Consider music for a moment. What makes music music? Is it merely the notes? Of course not. It's the silence between the notes that gives them meaning, that creates rhythm and melody and harmony. Without rests, without pauses, without the spaces of silence that separate one phrase from another, music would be nothing but noise, an undifferentiated cacophony. The master musician knows that silence is not the enemy of music, but its very soul. Mozart once said, "The music is not in the notes, but in the silence between." He understood this paradox completely. Now apply this to your own life. What are you but a kind of music? Your existence unfolds in time with rhythms and patterns, crescendos and diminuendos, major and minor keys. But you've been taught to fear the rests, the silent measures. You think that if you stop doing, stop achieving, stop making noise, you'll cease to exist somehow. You'll become irrelevant, forgotten, lost. So you keep performing, keep playing notes frantically, never allowing a pause, never permitting a moment of silence. And what's the result? Your life becomes noise, exhausting, meaningless noise. You lose the melody of your own being because you're too afraid to hear it. The strange thing is that we live in a culture that has completely misunderstood the relationship between sound and silence, between activity and rest, between doing and being. We think of silence as negative, as something to be overcome or filled in. We think of activity as positive, as the only thing that matters. And this fundamental confusion leads to the most extraordinary suffering. We burn ourselves out trying to prove our existence through constant busyness, constant noise, constant demonstration. We're like someone trying to prove that water is wet by splashing it everywhere, missing entirely that water's wetness is intrinsic to its nature, not something that needs to be proven or demonstrated. Let me take you deeper into this. When you sit in what you call silence, real silence, not just the absence of noise, but the cessation of mental chatter, something extraordinary begins to happen. At first, it's uncomfortable. You notice how loud your mind actually is. Thoughts cascade like a waterfall, worries about the future, regrets about the past, judgments about the present, endless planning, endless commentary. You realize that you've never actually been silent at all. You've been living in a perpetual echo chamber of your own making, listening only to the reverberations of your own voice, your own conditioning, your own limited perspective. But if you persist, and this requires no effort, only patience, the waterfall begins to slow. The thoughts come less frequently, and in those gaps between thoughts, you begin to notice something astonishing. You begin to hear what has always been there, but which you've been too busy to notice. You hear the actual texture of existence itself, not your ideas about it, not your interpretations of it, but the raw, unmediated reality of this moment as it actually is. And what you discover is that this silence is not at all empty or dead. It's alive, intensely alive. It vibrates with presence. It hums with being. In this silence, you realize that consciousness itself is a kind of listening. You are at your deepest level, not a thinker but a listener, not a doer but an observer, not a separate entity trying to manipulate the world, but an opening through which the universe becomes aware of itself. This is where the paradox really begins to reveal itself. In silence, everything speaks, but not in words. The tree outside your window speaks of rootedness and patience, of the slow miracle of growth, of the acceptance of changing seasons. The sky speaks of vastness and openness, of the emptiness that contains all forms. Your own body speaks constantly, if you listen, telling you what it needs, what it feels, what it knows instinctively about being alive. But you don't hear these voices because you're too busy talking to yourself, rehearsing conversations, planning futures, defending positions, maintaining your precious identity. The identity, here's the key to understanding why we fear silence so much. Your identity, what you call I or me, is essentially a story you tell yourself in words. It's a narrative constructed out of memories, hopes, fears, achievements, failures, relationships, and roles. This story requires constant maintenance. You have to keep telling it to yourself and others to keep it alive. And this storytelling requires noise, the noise of thought, the noise of speech, the noise of activity that proves the story is real. What happens in silence is that this story begins to fall apart. Not because there's anything wrong with it, but because you see it for what it is, a story, not the truth. In silence, you realize that the you you've been so busy defending and promoting doesn't actually exist in the way you thought it did. It's not a solid, separate thing, but a fluid process, a constantly changing pattern of experiences and awareness. This realization can be terrifying because it threatens everything you thought, wow, I knew about yourself. Or it can be the most liberating discovery of your life because it means you're not trapped in the narrow confines of your story. You're something far vaster, far more mysterious. The ancient sages understood this. They spoke of the Tao that cannot be named, the Brahman beyond words, the void that is fullness, the silence that is music. They weren't being deliberately obscure or mystical. They were pointing to a direct experience that language can only hint at, the experience of reality before you divide it up into categories, before you impose your interpretations, before you separate yourself from it and call it other. When you taste this silence, even for a moment, everything changes. You begin to see that what you took to be solid and fixed is actually flowing and changing. What you thought was separate and independent is actually interconnected and interdependent. What you believed was you is actually an impersonal process of nature, like waves on the ocean or clouds in the sky. This isn't depressing or nihilistic, it's utterly liberating. Because if you're not this separate, isolated ego trying desperately to protect itself and advance itself in a hostile universe, then you're free to relax, to open, to participate in the great dance of existence without the constant anxiety of self-preservation. Now, you might be wondering how any of this applies to your actual life, to your job, your relationships, your problems and concerns. And this is where the teaching becomes practical, where the philosophy touches ground. Because the discovery of silence is not an escape from life, but a deeper engagement with it. When you begin to hear the silence beneath the noise, you become more present, more attentive, more alive to what's actually happening, rather than being lost in your thoughts about what's happening. Consider how you typically interact with another person. You're not really listening, are you? While they're speaking, you're preparing your response, judging what they're saying. Comparing it to your own experiences, waiting for your turn to talk, you're treating the conversation like a tennis match where you have to hit the ball back as quickly as possible. But genuine communication requires silence, the silence of actually receiving what another person is expressing, the silence of not immediately interpreting everything through the filter of your own agenda, the silence of simple presence. When you learn to bring this quality of silence into your relationships, everything transforms. People feel heard, perhaps for the first time in their lives. And when people feel heard, really heard, not just waited upon while someone prepares their rebuttal, they open up, they reveal themselves. Intimacy becomes possible, connection becomes real, but this only happens when you stop the constant noise of your own self-concern and become quiet enough to let another person in. The same applies to your work, whatever it might be. We've created this absurd culture of multitasking, where we pride ourselves on doing 17 things at once, checking email while on conference calls, while eating lunch, while thinking about dinner plans. And we wonder why we feel fragmented, exhausted, disconnected from any sense of meaning in what we do. The secret to mastery in any field is the capacity for deep concentration. And deep concentration requires silence, the silence of focusing on one thing completely, of giving yourself entirely to the task at hand without the constant distraction of mental noise. The great artists, scientists, craftspeople, they all understand this instinctively. They speak of getting in the zone or achieving flow, and what they're describing is a state where the chattering mind becomes quiet, and there's simply action happening, work unfolding, creation occurring without the interference of self-consciousness. The painter doesn't stand back from this. He canvas every 30 seconds thinking, am I painting well? Will people like this? Is this good enough? The painter becomes painting, the dancer becomes dance. The silence of total absorption allows the activity to flow naturally, spontaneously, efficiently. This is what the Zen masters meant by no mind, not that you lose your intelligence or capacity to think, but that you're not dominated by compulsive thinking. You can think when thinking is appropriate, and you can be still when stillness is appropriate. You're not trapped in the prison of your own mental commentary, constantly narrating your life to yourself as if you were a sports announcer calling a game. You're free to simply be, to respond freshly to each situation as it arises. And here's something remarkable. When you discover this silence, you also discover that you're not actually in control in the way you thought you were. Your thoughts arise by themselves. You don't decide what to think next any more than you decide what to hear next. Your actions flow from causes and conditions you didn't create. Your very sense of being a separate self, a controller, a doer, is itself just another thought arising in the silence. This isn't fatalism or passivity. It's the recognition that what you really are is not the little voice in your head, but the vast awareness in which that voice appears and disappears. When you realize this, truly realize it in your bones, you stop fighting with yourself. You stop the exhausting attempt to micromanage every aspect of your experience. You begin to trust the intelligence that's been operating your body all along, the intelligence that beats your heart, digests your food, heals your wounds, grows your hair, breathes your breath without any conscious control from you. This intelligence is extraordinarily sophisticated. It's been evolving for billions of years, and yet we think we know better. We think we have to control everything with our little conscious mind, which emerged just yesterday in evolutionary terms. The transformation that occurs when you discover silence is not something you can force or manufacture. It's not an achievement, not something to add to your resume, not another medal to pin on your ego. In fact, the ego, this persistent sense of being a separate self that needs to prove itself, improve itself, protect itself, is precisely what prevents the transformation from occurring. The ego is noise. It's the static that obscures the signal. And you cannot use the ego to overcome the ego any more than you can use darkness to create light. What happens instead is a kind of relaxation, a letting go. You stop trying so hard to be someone, to become something, to get somewhere. You recognize the futility of the entire project. And in that recognition, which is itself a form of silence, something shifts. It's like a camera coming into focus. Suddenly you see clearly what was always right in front of you, but which you were too agitated to perceive. You see that you've been chasing your own tail, running in circles, trying to grasp water with your fist. You've been seeking happiness, seeking peace, seeking fulfillment, as if these were objects somewhere out there that you needed to acquire. But happiness is what you are when you stop seeking happiness. Peace is what remains when the war with yourself ends. Fulfillment is the natural state when you stop trying to fill yourself with things, experiences, achievements, relationships, when you recognize that you're already complete, that nothing is lacking, that the sense of lack was itself an illusion created by thought. This is not positive thinking or self-affirmation. I'm not telling you to convince yourself that you're complete when you feel incomplete. I'm pointing to something far more radical, the discovery that the very one who feels incomplete is itself an illusion, a phantom, a story you've been telling yourself for so long that you've forgotten it's just a story. When you see through the story, when you recognize the fictional nature of the separate self, the whole problem of feeling incomplete simply dissolves. It's like waking up from a nightmare and realizing that the monster chasing you never existed outside your dream. Now, this dissolution of the separate self is what spiritual traditions have called enlightenment, awakening, liberation, salvation, different words pointing to the same transformation. But we've made a terrible mistake with these words. We've turned them into goals, into attainments, into special states that special people achieve through special efforts. And this completely misses the point. Enlightenment is not a state you enter. It's the recognition that you never left home, that you were never separate, that the entire search was based on a misunderstanding. The misunderstanding is this: you think you're a skin-encapsulated ego, an isolated consciousness trapped inside a bag of flesh, peering out at a world that's alien and other. But that's not what you are at all. You're an activity of the universe, like a wave is an activity of the ocean. The wave may feel separate from the ocean, may think of itself as an independent entity, but that's absurd. The wave is the ocean waving. In exactly the same way, you are the universe peopling, the cosmos becoming conscious of itself through this particular aperture, this particular organism. When you realize this, not intellectually but viscerally, everything relaxes. The constant tension of trying to secure yourself in an insecure world dissolves. You recognize that you can't fall out of the universe, can't be separated from existence, because you are existence. You're not in the universe like an object in a container. You're an expression of the universe, a focal point through which the whole thing experiences itself. And here's the beautiful paradox. When you stop trying to save yourself, when you stop trying to improve yourself, when you stop trying to become pretend, that's when transformation becomes possible. Because the one who's trying to become enlightened is the very obstacle to enlightenment. The ego, trying to become egoless, is like an actor who's so absorbed in their role that they've forgotten their acting. The solution is not to act better, it's to recognize that you're acting. This recognition doesn't mean you become passive or indifferent. On the contrary, you become more engaged, more responsive, more alive. But you're no longer acting from the cramped, fearful space of the separate self. You're acting from wholeness, from completeness, from the silence that contains everything. Your actions become spontaneous, appropriate, effortless, not because you've programmed yourself to behave in certain ways, but because you're no longer interfering with your own natural intelligence. Think of it this way. A tree doesn't try to be a tree. It doesn't wake up in the morning and think, today I must be a better tree than I was yesterday. I must try harder to grow, to produce oxygen, to reach toward the sun. The tree simply is, and in that simple being it fulfills its nature perfectly. It doesn't split itself into an actor and a critic, into someone who performs and someone who judges the performance. There's just the tree being tree, doing what trees do. You are no different. When you stop splitting yourself, when you stop being simultaneously the performer and the audience, the liver of life and the commentator on life, you discover an extraordinary grace in your actions. You discover that life knows how to live itself. The body knows how to breathe, the heart knows how to beat, the mind knows how to think when thinking is needed. The constant intervention of the ego, trying to control and manage everything, is not necessary. It's actually the source of most of your problems. Silence teaches you this. In silence, you discover that you can trust existence, you can trust the process, you can trust that the universe that has brought you into being knows what it's doing. This doesn't mean that pain disappears or that difficulties vanish. Life continues to include challenges, losses, changes, but you meet these experiences differently. Instead of resisting what is, instead of constantly wishing things were other than they are, you develop a capacity to be with what is. Not passively, not as a doormat, but with an alert, responsive presence. This is the great freedom that silence offers, freedom from the tyranny of your own thoughts, freedom from the compulsion to control everything, freedom from the anxiety of being a separate self in a threatening world. And in this freedom you discover something unexpected. You discover that the silence itself is love, not sentimentality, not emotion, but the fundamental connectedness of all things, the recognition that there is no other to be feared or defended against. There is only this vast field of being, manifesting in infinite forms, and you are that field, not separate from it. The paradox resolves itself here. Silence is not emptiness, but fullness. In silence, everything speaks, because silence is not the absence of the world, but its very presence, unfiltered by the mind's incessant commentary. When you're silent, truly silent, you don't withdraw from life. You enter into life more deeply. You taste it directly rather than through the medium of thought. You see it as it is rather than through the lens of your conditioning. You hear what it's saying to you in every moment. What is it saying? It's saying, be here. This moment, exactly as it is all there is, not because there's no future or past, but because the future and past exist only as ideas in this present moment. This now is not a point in time that's being constantly replaced by the next now. It's the timeless presence in which all time appears, and you are that presence, not the you that you think you are, the you with a history and a future, but the awareness that's reading these words right now, the consciousness that's aware of being aware. Rest in that. Don't try to grasp it or understand it with your thinking mind. Simply notice that you are aware, and notice that this awareness is not located anywhere. It's not in your head or in your body. It's not personal or individual. It's the space in which everything appears. Thoughts, sensations, perceptions, the whole show. And this space is silent, profoundly silent. Yet in this silence, all sounds arise. In this emptiness, all forms appear. In this stillness, all movement occurs. So I leave you with this. Can you find the silence beneath your thoughts? Can you locate the awareness that's aware of your experience? Not as an achievement, not as something to attain, but simply as a recognition of what's already the case. Can you hear what the silence is saying when you stop talking to yourself? Can you discover that in the paradox of silence, everything has always been speaking, the trees, the stars, the very atoms of your body, in a language that has no words, that requires no translation, that you've always understood but forgotten you knew? Listen, be still, and discover that you are not separate from what you're listening to. The listener and the listened to are one. In that recognition, the paradox dissolves. There is only this, vast, immediate, undeniable, silent and speaking simultaneously, empty and full, nothing and everything. This is your nature. This is what you are, not something to become, but something to recognize. The silence has been waiting for you to hear it all along. Now you know you are the silence, and in you everything speaks.